On the afternoon of April 13, 1919, thousands gathered peacefully in Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden in the heart of Amritsar, the spiritual capital of the Sikh community. Some came to observe Baisakhi, the vibrant spring harvest festival, a day of joyous celebration and religious significance. Some came to peacefully protest the unjust arrests of their respected leaders. Some were simply unaware of the prohibitory orders that had been imposed on public gatherings, but none of them could have imagined the brutal fate that awaited them within those high, enclosing walls. They were walking into a meticulously laid trap. What happened next would sear itself into the collective memory of a nation, becoming one of the darkest and most shameful chapters in British colonial history. This is the true and harrowing story of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. India, 1919. The Great War, the First World War, had finally drawn to a close, leaving a world reeling from unprecedented loss and upheaval. But for the people of India, the sacrifices made during the war, with millions of Indian soldiers sent to fight and die for the British Empire on distant battlefields, had yielded no tangible reward. Promises of greater autonomy and political representation made by the British to garner Indian support during the war remained unfulfilled, breeding deep resentment and disillusionment. Instead of progress, the British government, fearing growing nationalist sentiments and calls for self-rule, tightened its grip. They introduced and swiftly passed the draconian Rowlatt Acts. This oppressive legislation, officially titled the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919, granted the colonial administration sweeping powers. It allowed for the arrest and detention of individuals suspected of sedition or revolutionary activities without warrant, without trial, and without the right to legal counsel. The message sent by the Rowlatt Acts was chillingly clear. Any form of dissent against British rule would be met with swift and ruthless suppression. Basic civil liberties were to be disregarded in the name of maintaining order. In the vibrant and politically charged province of Punjab, the atmosphere was thick with palpable tension. The arbitrary nature of the Rowlatt Acts ignited widespread anger and a burgeoning civil disobedience movement. On April 10, 1919, two highly respected and influential Indian nationalist leaders in Amritsar, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu, a barrister, and Dr. Satyapal, a physician, were arrested by the British authorities without any legitimate cause or explanation. Their arrests, perceived as a blatant act of injustice and an affront to the community, sent shockwaves of outrage through the local populace. The people of Amritsar, already simmering with discontent over the Rowlatt Acts, took to the streets in peaceful protests, demanding the immediate release of their leaders. These initial demonstrations, though non-violent, were met with force by the British police, further escalating the already volatile situation. Just 3 days later, on April 13th, a large gathering was planned at Jallianwala Bagh. This public garden, historically significant and a common meeting place within the densely populated old city of Amritsar, was enclosed on all sides by high walls, with only a few narrow entrances and exits. Thousands of people converged there that afternoon. Many were local residents of Amritsar, including families dressed in their finest attire to celebrate the auspicious festival of Baisakhi. Others were villagers who had traveled from the surrounding rural areas to participate in the religious festivities and were largely unaware of the recent political turmoil and the imposition of martial law earlier that day. They came for peaceful assembly, to voice their opposition to the unjust arrests, to partake in the Baisakhi celebrations, unaware that the city was now under strict military rule, which prohibited all public gatherings. There were women carrying infants, children playing innocently, and elderly men and women seeking solace and community. There were no visible warning signs posted at the entrance of Jallianwala Bagh to inform the attendees about the newly imposed restrictions. No soldiers were initially present. No official announcements were made, offering no hint of the impending horror that was about to unfold. At around 5:15 p.m., as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the garden, Brigadier General Reginald Harry Dyer, a military officer known for his rigid and uncompromising approach to maintaining British authority, arrived at the narrow lane that served as the main entrance to Jallianwala Bagh. He marched in with a contingent of approximately 90 soldiers. These troops consisted of Gurkha riflemen from Nepal, Baluchi soldiers, and Sikh soldiers. Ironically, some of whom shared the same faith as many of those trapped within the garden. Dyer strategically positioned his troops, effectively blocking the only significant exit point of the enclosed garden. This deliberate act ensured that the thousands gathered inside had no means of escape. Without any prior warning, without making any attempt to communicate with the peaceful assembly, without ordering the crowd to disperse, Brigadier General Dyer, with cold and calculated intent, gave the direct order to his troops. Fire! 1,650 rounds of ammunition were unleashed upon the unarmed and defenseless crowd in a matter of approximately 10 horrifying minutes. The sudden volley of gunfire ripped through the peaceful gathering, shattering the festive atmosphere and turning it into a scene of unimaginable terror and carnage. People screamed in agony and disbelief. They desperately tried to flee, to find any semblance of cover from the relentless hail of bullets, but the high walls that had once provided a sense of enclosure now became their inescapable prison. Panic erupted as the crowd surged towards the narrow exits, creating deadly bottlenecks where people were trampled underfoot in their desperate attempts to escape. Some, in a desperate bid to evade the gunfire, jumped into an old, disused well located within the garden. The soldiers, under Dyer's command, continued to fire indiscriminately into the dense crowd, showing no mercy towards the innocent men, women, and children. The relentless firing only ceased when the troops reportedly ran out of ammunition. The immediate aftermath was a scene of unspeakable horror. The garden was littered with the bodies of the dead and the wounded, lying in pools of blood. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and the cries of the injured and the bereaved. At least 120 bodies, including those of women and children, were later pulled out of the well, a testament to the sheer desperation of those seeking refuge from the bullets. Official British records, notoriously conservative and often downplaying the scale of colonial atrocities, claimed that 379 people were killed and over 1,200 were wounded. However, Indian nationalist leaders and eyewitness accounts vehemently contested these figures, estimating that over 1,000 innocent lives were lost that tragic day, with thousands more sustaining injuries. The true extent of the casualties remains a haunting testament to the brutality of the massacre. The wounded were left largely unattended, with a curfew imposed on the city preventing their families and medical assistance from reaching them until the following morning, exacerbating the suffering and increasing the death toll. Dyer, far from expressing any remorse or regret for his actions, remained defiant and unrepentant. In fact, he chillingly claimed that his actions were necessary to prevent a supposed rebellion and to uphold British authority. When later questioned during the Hunter Commission inquiry about why he did not issue a warning to the crowd before ordering his troops to fire, his response was cold and dismissive. He stated that he deemed it not a time for talking. His intent, he chillingly admitted, was not merely to disperse the crowd, but to inflict a significant punishment that would serve as a deterrent to any future acts of defiance against British rule. Instead of facing widespread condemnation back in Britain, Dyer's actions astonishingly found support in certain conservative circles. A public fundraising campaign was launched in his name, incredibly collecting over £26,000, a substantial sum at the time, as a reward for his perceived service to the empire. However, there were voices of dissent within Britain. Winston Churchill, then the Secretary of War, was a notable exception, vehemently denouncing the massacre in a powerful speech to Parliament, calling it a monstrous event, a slaughter, and an act that had no precedent or parallel in the modern history of the British Empire. Despite this condemnation from some quarters, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer faced no significant prison time or real punitive consequences for his horrific actions. He was eventually relieved of his command but allowed to retire with a pension, a decision that further fueled anger and resentment in India. The news of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre sent a seismic shockwave throughout the entire Indian subcontinent, profoundly altering the course of the Indian independence movement. Rabindranath Tagore, the esteemed Bengali poet and Nobel laureate, was so deeply appalled by the brutality of the massacre and the subsequent lack of accountability that he renounced his knighthood, a symbolic act of profound protest against the injustice. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who had initially supported the British Empire during the First World War and advocated for cooperation, was utterly disillusioned by the massacre. He described it as a turning point in his own political awakening, leading him to abandon his previous stance and become a fervent advocate for complete and unconditional independence, Swaraj. Across the length and breadth of the nation, the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre became a potent and unifying rallying cry for the burgeoning nationalist movement. It transcended regional, religious, and caste divisions, uniting people from all walks of life in their shared grief and their collective determination to end British colonial rule. The massacre, intended to terrorize and subdue the Indian populace, had the opposite effect, transforming profound grief and outrage into a powerful and sustained resistance movement. More than a century has passed since that horrific afternoon, but the soil of Jallianwala Bagh, now a solemn memorial, still seems to bear witness to the innocent blood that was spilled there. The physical bullets may have long since been silenced, but their agonizing echo continues to reverberate through the annals of history, a stark reminder of the brutality of colonialism and the immense cost of oppression. This is not merely a recounting of a tragic historical event. It is a profound and enduring reminder that the precious ideal of freedom is never freely given, but must be fought for and fiercely defended, and that the pursuit of justice, no matter how long or arduous the struggle, must never be silenced, for the sake of those who suffered and for the generations to come. The memory of Jallianwala Bagh serves as a potent symbol of the sacrifices made in the pursuit of liberation, and a constant vigil against the recurrence of such inhumanity. If you enjoyed this video and want more stories like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got much more coming.